Welcome to day 2 of Penn Law's Advancing Inclusive Leadership. Today we convene the nation's top business leaders for a conversation on joining the vanguard of leadership at an inflection point in the political economy of our times. This conversation takes place against the backdrop of a nation and a world gripped in a crisis of leadership and dividing forces. While Justice Ginsburg's legacy continues to provide us a way to address inequality and stereotypes, her legacy itself is at stake. Kimberly Crenshaw gave us a lexicon to speak on intersections, and Isabel Wilkerson provides us with a new language to speak of modern-day bias protocols. But the discourse on inclusion itself is under attack. The dual forces of COVID and a mass global public reckoning on race have revealed new inequalities, but yet the gains made in the last decade on inclusion are likely to be reversed and rolled back. The social justice movements on Black Lives Matter and Me Too have gone global, but there is also a backlash that is brewing. If ever there was a time for leadership, it is now. And these leaders gathered today are those who will rise to this challenge. Martin Luther King famously said, "There comes a time when time itself is ready for change." Mitch Zuklie, the CEO of ORIC, is a leader for these times. He is leading a quiet revolution at ORIC to invest in inclusion. And although ORIC is the leading tech law firm, when history is written, Mitch Zuklie's diversity efforts at ORIC might very well be his most enduring legacy. When James McGregor Burns drew a distinction between the transactional and the transformational leader, he was indeed talking of leaders such as Mitch Zuklie. Mitch is distinguished by the fact that he is concerned with values of justice and equality, rather than the transactional values of day-to-day operations. Such a leader is Mitch Zuklie. So Mitch, what I will ask you today is to share with us some of the leadership values and the core diversity initiatives at ORIC, which can help to shape the future of our world and the future of work. Mitch?
Thank you for such a generous and lovely introduction, and it's an honor to be here. I'm grateful to you and to Penn Law for giving me a moment to address your audience, and I'm honored to do it before such an extraordinary group of panelists. I'd like to say that I think there's an interesting paradox going on right now. Clearly, this is a time of crisis, and inclusion is more important than ever. And there's no question that systemic problems require systemic change. There's just no doubt about that. But I also think that that systemic change only works if it happens person by person. And one of the things that we feel is a real business imperative is to make sure that all of us at our organization feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. There's a quote that we use regularly here from Brene Brown, which is, if we want people to show up, to bring their whole selves, including their unarmored whole hearts, so that we can innovate, solve problems, and serve people, we have to be vigilant about creating a culture in which people feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. And I would like to spend a few moments talking about 5 aspects, I think, of how we can collectively make sure that people feel safe, seen, heard, and respected in order to bring about systemic change. The first is very simple, and that's to listen. And I think all of us who have been involved in thinking about and caring about inclusion, belonging, and diversity have been humbled by how much more we have had to listen in 2020. I have found that almost all of us who have felt that we had an understanding of how some of our colleagues felt prior to Black Lives Matter had a cold shower and a disappointing awakening that we had an awful lot of listening left to do. And I think that that concept of paying attention to voices that you ordinarily do not hear from and soliciting input from them is a vitally important start for bringing systemic change. The second thing I'd say is that it's important, I believe, in order to bring about systemic change, to be thoughtful and bold. I'm a big fan of Chris Reynolds from Toyota Motors. He's a member of our firm's diversity and inclusion board, and he always is pushing those board members to make more bold moves. I would say from our own experience, one of the things that has really been important for us is to make continued progress in having more diverse leadership in our more diverse voices in our leadership. At some point, that constant push, I think, has been met with confusion or some reticence. But I can tell you that we would have not gotten through 2020 without a diversity of voices around our leadership table in the way that we have. Third, I think, and almost most importantly, you need to have clear goals with metrics. What gets measured matters. And I think that a couple of the things that we have experienced are simple examples of things that others can use to great effect. First and foremost, I think that it's very important for companies to do the type of thing that Microsoft has done. Microsoft, for those who aren't familiar, has provided a 2% diversity bonus tied to very concrete, measurable, and I think quite thoughtful metrics that are developed not just by them top down, but by them in conjunction with their business partners. And I think that sends a very powerful message that's incredibly useful internally. It has impact well beyond Microsoft, and it causes a rich dialogue in firms all around the country like ours. And I also think that the carrot approach of Microsoft is, in my view, much more effective than the stick approach. People can differ about that, and it's an interesting debate. But I really think that concept of coming up with metrics that involve a carrot, that are carefully constructed with the voices of others, matter. I think a second really important thing that we're seeing in my industry is the Mansfield Rule. For those who aren't familiar with it, that is an adoption of the Rooney Rule from the NFL. It was led by Diversity Lab to ensure that at least 30% of candidate pools were diverse. And that grew from participation of, I think, 40 firms 4 years ago to something more like 125 today. It has been a very powerful movement, and it's been a movement that has once again linked a group of people in an industry who are measuring something and sharing data with one another. I think another important example of that is Move the Needle, also launched by the same organization that created the Mansfield Rule, but it's designed to bring together in unison 25 leading legal departments with 5 law firms in order to make sure that those firms are making progress in ways that are measurable and concrete to their organizations and visible to their most important clients. Finally, I think that the fifth thing that is critically important to make progress on inclusion is having bias interrupters, concrete, thoughtful ways to interrupt bias. And I think that one of the things that's great is that there's been examples of this that have worked in many different settings. So for example, we are currently working with a feedback program that's designed basically from a program that the military used. We are using a series of tracking technology to make sure that our sponsorship teams have visibility into the work assignments that people are getting. We're using Looped In as a form of communication to make sure that that we are getting a best set of communication and collaboration among remote team members to make sure that people who are not physically proximate to someone down the hall from them get an advantage relative to those who might not be put in that situation. And we're using a series of interviews, which cycle back to my first comment around listening, to make sure that we understand why people would rather stay at the firm, what would make them want to stay, rather than simply doing those interviews when they exit. The examples I've provided around listening, about boldness, but having clear metrics and making sure that you have bias interrupters are, of course, only small steps. And there are but a few of the examples that many organizations are providing. But I think that they are essential in order to make sure that we create an environment where people feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. And I think ultimately that is the path by which we will be able to make systemic change, by creating that sense of individual belonging so that we can all bring our unarmored whole hearts and bring our best to work. So complete pleasure. I hope that those small examples are of value, and I will let you get on to your esteemed panel, but it's been a complete honor to address this group, and I'm delighted if anyone would ever like to talk to us offline to engage in that discussion. Thank you so much for the invitation.